The legacy of boxing is often one that is passed down from one fighter to the next, not just through bloodlines but through the battles fought in the ring, the struggles outside of it, and the weight of national pride carried on broad shoulders. In 2017, this dynamic was thrust into the spotlight when Canelo Alvarez, already Mexico's most promising fighter and a man widely seen as the future of the sport, squared off against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., the son of the greatest Mexican boxer to ever lace up gloves. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. The clash, scheduled for May 6th at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, was billed as something larger than a prize fight. It was a cultural event, a question of pride, and perhaps even a symbolic test of what it meant to be a true Mexican boxing champion. While many fans clamored for Canelo to meet Gennady Triple G Golovkin in the ring that year, Alvarez instead chose a different route. Rather than stepping directly into a battle with the Kazakh knockout artist, he opted for a showdown with Chavez Jr., a fight that was as much about legacy and personal pride as it was about belts or rankings. This decision split opinion at the time. Some saw it as Canelo avoiding the bigger challenge in Golovkin, while others recognized the immense significance of facing the son of Mexico's most revered boxing icon on Cinco de Mayo weekend. By this point in his career, Canelo had already built a resume that was impressive by any measure. He had accumulated nearly 50 fights, with the only blemish on his record being a loss to Floyd Mayweather Jr. back in 2013. That defeat had been educational rather than crushing, exposing him to the masterful technique of one of the greatest defensive boxers in history while still leaving him young, hungry, and with plenty of room to grow. He had since rattled off victories against names like Amir and Liam Smith, both of whom he dispatched with relative ease. The knockout of Khan in particular had stunned fans worldwide, a vicious right hand that left the British fighter sprawled on the canvas, his ambitions halted in dramatic fashion. Against Smith, Canelo captured the WBO light middleweight title, once again showing his ability to break down bigger opponents with punishing body shots and clinical power. These wins had solidified his status as Mexico's current boxing king, but there were still questions left unanswered. Was he ready to step up in weight against naturally larger men? Was he truly the heir to the mantle once carried by Chavez Sr.? Chavez Jr., meanwhile, had a career that was as frustrating as it was promising. On paper, his record was glittering, boasting more than 50 victories with only a pair of defeats. He had a granite chin, something he clearly inherited from his father, and in his prime he was capable of grinding down opponents with relentless pressure and heavy-handed combinations. Wins against the likes of Andy Lee and Marco Antonio Rubio demonstrated his toughness and capability, and for a time he was spoken of as the natural successor to his father's throne. But there were always question marks. Discipline was a constant issue. He struggled to maintain focus in training camps, often arriving overweight or underprepared, and his lifestyle outside of boxing became a frequent topic of criticism. Tales of excessive partying, brushes with the law, and questionable associations with unsavory figures dogged his reputation. By the time the fight with Canelo was announced, Chavez Jr. was seen as a fading figure, a man blessed with the genetic gifts of his legendary father, but lacking the mentality required to truly carve his own path to greatness. The lead-up to the fight carried immense hype. Cinco de Mayo weekend had long been a fixture for major boxing events, particularly those involving Mexican fighters, and this bout had all the ingredients of a blockbuster. The promotional material leaned heavily on the legacy of the Chavez name, framing the fight as a passing of the torch, or perhaps even a reclamation of national pride by Chavez Jr. Many fans wondered aloud whether this could be the night that Julio Jr. finally lived up to the family name and delivered the kind of performance that had eluded him for years. For Canelo, the bout represented a different kind of challenge. It was not merely about defeating a man inside the ring, but about proving to the Mexican people that he, and not Chavez Jr., was the true standard-bearer of their proud boxing tradition. And fight night, the atmosphere inside the T-Mobile Arena was electric. Over 20,000 fans packed the venue, with millions more watching around the world. The Mexican flags waved proudly in the stands, chants echoed through the arena, and anticipation hung thick in the air. When the opening bell rang, it was immediately apparent that this was not going to be the war that many had hoped for. Canelo came out sharp, controlled, and deliberate. From the first exchanges, he imposed his will on Chavez Jr., landing crisp jabs, snapping right hands, and thudding body shots that echoed in the crowd. Rather than attempting to overwhelm Chavez with reckless aggression, Alvarez fought with calculated precision, tenderizing his opponent and asserting dominance without rushing into unnecessary risks. Chavez Jr., by contrast, looked hesitant and gun-shy. Despite his size advantage, he had entered the fight as the naturally larger man, with a broader frame and longer reach. He failed to impose himself. Instead of pressing forward in the style that had once made his father a legend, he allowed himself to be backed up, pinned against the ropes, and peppered with combinations. Whenever he tried to mount an offense, Canelo responded with sharper, faster counters that made Chavez think twice about committing. It quickly became apparent that this was not a competitive contest, but rather a one-sided exhibition in which Canelo was the teacher and Chavez the reluctant student. By the middle rounds, the fight had taken on the feel of a sparring session. Alvarez was toying with his opponent, smirking at times, and clearly enjoying himself. He mixed his shots to the head and body, showcasing the full array of his arsenal, yet never seemed in any rush to finish matters. There was a sense among many observers that he could have ended the fight at any point had he chosen to press harder, but instead he opted to prolong the punishment, perhaps as a way of sending a message. This was not merely about winning, but about humiliating Chavez Jr., about stripping away any lingering illusion that he might someday fill his father's shoes. For Mexican fans, watching Canelo dominate in this fashion was both exhilarating and bittersweet. On the one hand, it confirmed their nation's pride in Alvarez as a once-in-a-generation talent, the fighter worthy of carrying the flag into the future. On the other, it underscored the disappointment of Chavez Jr., a man whose famous name had promised so much but delivered so little. The fight dragged on in this manner round after round. Canelo's accuracy was remarkable, his defense tight, and his composure unshaken. Chavez absorbed the blows with the same iron chin that had defined his father, but offered little in return. His face swelled, blood trickled from his nose, and his eyes bore the look of a man who knew he was out of his depth. Still, he did not quit, and in that at least he honored his lineage. But survival was all he managed. By the championship rounds, the pattern was firmly established. Canelo pressing, Chavez retreating, and the crowd alternating between cheers for Alvarez's artistry and jeers for Junior's passivity. When the final bell rang, there was no doubt as to the outcome. The judges' scorecards reflected the one-sided nature of the contest, awarding Canelo every round in a shutout decision. The aftermath was as telling as the fight itself. Alvarez, now undeniably Mexico's #1 fighter, had further solidified his reputation. He had stepped up in weight, dominated a larger man, and claimed the symbolic crown of Mexican boxing for himself. The victory set the stage for the long-awaited showdown with Golovkin, which would finally materialize later that year. For Chavez Jr., however, the loss marked the beginning of a steep decline. Whatever credibility he had left was shattered that night. Fans and pundits alike concluded that he lacked the drive, the discipline, and the hunger to ever become more than a shadow of his father. Attempts at comebacks in the years that followed only deepened this perception. His later loss to former UFC champion Anderson Silva, in particular, was seen as a humiliating low point, confirming that he had squandered his gifts and would never again be relevant on the world stage. Canelo, conversely, continued to rise. The Chavez fight, though not among his most difficult challenges, was nonetheless pivotal. It was a cultural coronation, a moment in which he definitively claimed the identity of Mexico's boxing leader. While fights against men like Golovkin, Sergey Kovalev, and later Dmitry Bivol would test his skills at the highest levels, the Chavez bout remained memorable for its symbolism. It was less about competition and more about narrative. The dedicated craftsman vanquishing the entitled heir, the hard-working warrior proving himself worthy of carrying forward a nation's fighting spirit. Even Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., who had long supported his son, openly acknowledged his admiration for Canelo's performance, in effect conceding that Alvarez was the son he wished he had in the boxing sense. In the years since, fans have continued to debate where this fight ranks among Canelo's many triumphs. Some dismiss it as little more than a glorified exhibition, pointing to Chavez Jr.'s lack of effort as evidence that it was never truly competitive. Others argue that the historical and cultural significance elevates it beyond the level of a mere mismatch, placing it alongside his most important victories. What is undeniable is that it remains one of the most talked-about events of his career, a night when all of Mexico watched and understood that their future in the sport rested not with the famous name of Chavez, but with the red-haired warrior from Guadalajara. Ultimately, the story of Canelo versus Chavez Jr. is not simply about what happened in the ring that night in Las Vegas. It is about the contrasting paths of two men who carried the hopes of a nation in different ways. Chavez Jr. represented the weight of legacy, the burden of being the son of a legend, and the struggle to carve out an identity in the shadow of greatness. Canelo represented the power of discipline, the fruits of relentless hard work, and the ability to rise above expectations through sheer will and talent. Their clash was less a contest of equals than a symbolic passing of judgment, a public verdict on who truly deserved to be called Mexico's champion. And in that regard, the outcome could not have been clearer. As the dust settled and the years rolled on, Chavez Jr. faded into obscurity, remembered more for what he failed to become than for what he achieved. Canelo, on the other hand, continued to etch his name into history, amassing titles across multiple weight classes and cementing his legacy as one of the greatest Mexican fighters of all time. The contrast between the two could not have been starker. For Chavez Jr., that night in May 2017 was the beginning of the end. For Canelo, it was a crowning moment, a declaration of dominance, and a celebration of the spirit that had always defined Mexican boxing: courage, pride, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. And so, the fight that was once seen as a potential passing of the torch became something very different. It was not the continuation of a dynasty, but the conclusion of one, a final confirmation that the Chavez name, however great in the past, would not carry into the future. Instead, it was Canelo Alvarez who emerged as the rightful heir, the true successor to Mexico's boxing throne, and the fighter who would carry the nation's dreams into the next era.